Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. But that was before Lakewood, before everything that happened in that house. I didn't grow up in a spooky old mansion or a house with a tragic past. I didn't have one of those childhoods where you hear noises in the attic or have an imaginary friend who turns out to be a ghost. My life was normal, just boringly normal. I was 24 when I moved into the house on Lakewood Drive. It was a rental, nothing fancy, but it was big, too big for just me. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a long hallway that always seemed a little too dim, no matter how many bulbs I replaced. The rent was surprisingly cheap for the size, which should have been my first red flag. But at the time, I was just happy to have space. I had been looking for a place for a while, something quiet and affordable, and when I came across the listing, I didn't hesitate. The landlord was an older man, stiff and unreadable. He handed me the keys without much small talk, just told me to let him know if I had any issues. He didn't even ask for a security deposit. Looking back, that should have been another red flag. I moved in on a warm August afternoon, my car packed with boxes, furniture delivered later that evening. The first night was uneventful. I set up my bed, put a few things in place, and by midnight, I was out cold. No eerie feelings. No unsettling sounds. Just a new place, slightly unfamiliar, but nothing more than that. Over the next week, I settled into my routine. I worked from home as a freelance writer, which meant I spent a lot of time inside. Mornings were quiet. I'd wake up, make coffee, sit by the window where the light streamed in just right, and work until I needed a break. Afternoons were slow. The occasional break to run errands or stretch my legs. Evenings, I'd watch something mindless on TV, maybe scroll through my phone before bed. At first, the house felt empty, like I wasn't used to so much space. The silence was thick. I'd catch myself leaving a TV on in the background just to fill the quiet. The air inside always felt still, like a room where nobody had breathed for too long. I told myself it was just a matter of adjusting. The neighborhood was quiet too. The street was lined with old houses, most of them well kept but lived in, their paint slightly faded, their porches showing signs of age. I didn't see my neighbors much, just the occasional nod if we crossed paths. One night, about a week in, I met the woman next door. She was older, maybe late 60s, with sharp eyes that seemed to see through me. She stood on her porch as I took the trash out, watching me in a way that made me hesitate before I spoke. "Evening," I said, lifting a hand in a small wave. She nodded, but didn't smile. "You're in the Lakewood house now." Something about the way she said it sent a chill up my spine. "Not your house. The Lakewood house." Like the place itself was separate from me, from anyone who lived in it. "Yeah," I said, forcing a chuckle. "Just moved in last week." She held my gaze for a second too long before saying, "You keep your doors locked at night." Then, without another word, she turned and went back inside. I stood there for a moment, gripping the trash bag, my stomach twisting for no reason I could explain. It was probably nothing. Just an old woman being cautious, maybe a little nosy. But that night, for the first time since I moved in, I locked every door and window before I went to bed. I told myself I was just being careful, that it was just a habit I should have already had. But then the noises started. It started small, so small that, at first, I didn't even think much of it. The first noise came 3 nights after my conversation with the woman next door. It was past midnight, and I had just finished watching a movie on my laptop. I wasn't fully tired yet, so I stayed up, scrolling mindlessly through my phone in bed. The house was silent, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of the silence itself. Then I heard it, a soft tap, tap, tap coming from the hallway. I froze, my thumb hovering over my phone screen. It was faint, but steady, like footsteps, but lighter, too light to belong to anyone walking. More like something being dropped against the hardwood floor at a slow, rhythmic pace. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from just outside my bedroom door. I sat up, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. The house was locked. I had double-checked every door and window before going to bed. No one could have gotten inside. I turned on my bedside lamp, the warm light flooding the room. The tapping noise stopped instantly. For a few moments, I just sat there, listening, my pulse in my throat. I waited. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Nothing. After a minute, I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe I was just tired, my ears playing tricks on me. Houses settle at night, right? Old wood shifts, pipes creak. Still, I got up and opened the door. The hallway was empty. The only thing out of place was one of my shoes, a single sneaker that had been near the front door earlier. Now, it was sitting in the middle of the hallway. I frowned, staring at it. I knew I hadn't left it there. But at the same time, I had been moving things around earlier in the day. Maybe I had kicked it without realizing. Maybe I just forgot. I picked it up, put it back by the door, and went to bed. I forced myself not to dwell on it. But the next morning, something else was off. The kitchen chair. I had a small dining table in the kitchen with 4 wooden chairs. I always kept them tucked in when I wasn't using them, just a habit. But when I walked in that morning, one of the chairs was pulled out. Not just slightly, but all the way, as if someone had sat there and pushed it back when they got up. I stopped in the doorway, staring at it. I knew I hadn't left it like that. I tried to reason through it. Maybe I had pulled it out and forgotten. Maybe I had bumped into it at some point. But deep down, something felt wrong. I sat down, my coffee growing cold as I stared at the chair, at the hallway beyond it, at the empty stillness of the house. The thought hit me then, creeping in like an unwelcome guest. What if someone had been inside? I hadn't seen anything missing. Nothing was broken. And yet, the way the chair was positioned, it didn't feel accidental. I checked the locks again. Front door? Locked. Back door? Locked. Windows? Secure. Still, I spent the rest of the day unsettled, glancing at the hallway every so often. It was just a chair, just a shoe, things that could have explanations. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. That night, I double-checked every lock, turned on a hallway light, and went to bed with the uneasy sense that something wasn't right. And I was not wrong. After the first few incidents, I tried to convince myself that everything had an explanation. The shoe in the hallway? Maybe I forgot I moved it. The kitchen chair? Maybe I bumped into it without realizing. But the mind can only rationalize so much before the truth starts to sink in. Something was wrong in that house. And it wasn't going away. The tapping sound returned the next night, but this time it was different. It wasn't just soft taps in the hallway anymore. It was a slow, deliberate scratching. I woke up to the sound of it, my ears straining in the dark. It was coming from the bedroom door. A long, steady scratch, like nails dragging against wood. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The room was pitch black, except for the dim glow of the street lamp outside, casting faint, distorted shadows across the walls. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it at the door. The scratching stopped. Silence! I swallowed hard and swung my legs over the bed, heart hammering as I stood. My feet were ice cold against the hardwood floor. Slowly, I reached for the doorknob and twisted it open. The hallway stretched out before me, empty, silent. I flicked on the hallway light. Nothing. I checked the floor, expecting to see marks, but the wood was untouched. No scratches, no scuffs. But I knew what I heard. I checked the front and back doors again. Both locked. Windows? Still secure. I barely slept that night. Every sound made my skin prickle. Every creak in the old house felt intentional. The next few nights, the tapping and scratching came and went. Sometimes it was so faint that I wasn't sure if it was real. Other times it was clear, so deliberate it made my stomach twist. But the worst came a week later. I had just gotten into bed when I saw it. A shape. It was in the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The hallway was dimly lit from the small lamp I had started leaving on at night, but in the soft glow, I could see it, something tall, standing motionless against the wall. I held my breath. I didn't move. For a long moment, it didn't either. Then, slowly, it shifted. Not like a person walking, but gliding, almost too smooth, too fluid. It moved just slightly, just enough for me to know that it was real. I reached for my phone with shaking hands, my fingers barely gripping it as I turned on the flashlight. The second the light hit the hallway, the shape was gone. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding. I checked every inch of that hallway, opened the closet, looked under the table, even checked the bathroom. Nothing. But the feeling lingered. I wasn't alone in that house. The next day, I started searching for answers. I spent hours looking up the history of the house, checking old property records online, but there was nothing significant, no reports of deaths, no violent crimes. Still, the unease grew. And then I found the basement door. I hadn't paid much attention to it before. It was in the kitchen, near the back of the house. The landlord had mentioned the basement wasn't finished, just storage space. I had no reason to go down there. But that night, I noticed something odd. The door was unlocked. I knew I had never opened it. I had barely touched it since moving in. But now it was slightly ajar. A cold draft seeped up from the darkness below. I stood there, staring at the opening, my skin crawling. The air smelled different, stale, almost damp. I reached out, hesitated, then slowly pulled the door fully open. Wooden steps led down into complete darkness. Something about that space felt wrong. I wasn't sure why, but I had no desire to step inside. Instead, I did what any rational person would. I grabbed a chair, wedged it under the doorknob, and walked away. The next night, I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. At first, I didn't know why. Then, I heard it. A voice. Muffled. Low. Coming from inside the house. I sat up, every muscle tense. My ears strained to locate the sound. It was coming from the kitchen. I grabbed my phone, slid out of bed as quietly as possible, and crept toward the hallway. My pulse was a drumbeat in my skull. The voice was clearer now, whispering words I couldn't understand. I reached the kitchen doorway and stopped. The basement door was open. The chair I had wedged under the knob was pushed aside. The whispering stopped. A heavy silence filled the air, pressing down on me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the dark opening of the basement. Then, a creak, not from above, from below. Something was down there. My body moved before my mind could process it. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next few nights, the house was silent. No tapping, no scratching, no voices. Just an eerie, suffocating quiet. But then, on the fourth night, the footsteps started. I was lying in bed, forcing my eyes shut, trying to convince myself that everything had been in my head. Then, thump! A single, heavy step. Then another. And another. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. I shot up in bed, my hands clutching the blanket so tightly my fingers ached. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, knock, knock. A soft, rhythmic knock on the wood. My chest tightened, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, a whisper. Low, raspy, right against the door. Let me in. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I turned on the flashlight, aimed it at the door. Silence. No shadows. No movement. I forced myself out of bed, yanked the door open. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the floorboards were cold, like something had been standing there. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I didn't know what was happening in that house, but I knew one thing for certain. It wanted me to know it was there. By this point, my nerves were beyond frayed. The sleepless nights, the noises, the shadows, it was all starting to unravel me. Every time the sun set, a thick weight settled in my chest, a suffocating certainty that I wasn't alone in that house. I stopped trying to rationalize what was happening. I knew something was wrong, and I knew it was getting worse. That night, I sat on my bed, staring at the hallway lights spilling into my room. The air felt heavier than usual, thick and charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the bedroom door slammed shut. Hard! So hard the walls trembled. I jumped to my feet, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. My hands flew to the light switch. I flipped it up. Nothing. The room was pitch black. I grabbed my phone, shaking, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The second the beam of light cut through the darkness, my stomach dropped. The closet door. It was open. Wide open. I hadn't touched it in days. And then, a sound. Low, guttural, breathing, coming from inside the closet. I felt it before I saw it, a heavy, oppressive presence pressing against my skin. My vision blurred at the edges, my ears rang. I aimed the flashlight at the closet. Something moved. Something was in there. A shape, barely visible, crouched low, just behind the hanging clothes. The moment my light landed on it, the breathing stopped. And then it ran at me. I didn't even have time to think. I felt it before I saw it, a force so fast, so violent, that my entire body went cold. I threw myself backward, scrambling onto the bed, my flashlight shaking in my hands. The shape lunged out of the closet. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a shadow. It was wrong. Tall but hunched, like its spine was twisted at unnatural angles. Limbs too long. Hands that nearly scraped the floor. Its face, if it even had one, was a blur of darkness, shifting and writhing like smoke trapped under glass. And its eyes, two hollow pits, blacker than the night itself, locked onto me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It rushed me. The air turned ice cold as it closed the distance, a low, rattling breath scraping through the silence. I did the only thing I could. I grabbed the closest thing to me, a glass of water on my nightstand, and threw it. The second the water hit its form, the thing shrieked. Not a human scream. Not even an animal's cry. It was wrong, a sound that rattled inside my skull, vibrating through my bones. The lights flickered, once, twice, before the entire house went dark. And then, it was gone. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat on my bed until the sun crept through the window, every muscle in my body locked in place. I knew what I had to do. I had to go into the basement. Whatever was happening in this house, it started there. I waited until noon, until the sunlight felt strong enough to push back whatever darkness lurked beneath. Then I walked into the kitchen and stood in front of the basement door. The knob was cold against my palm. I turned it. The door swung open, revealing the wooden steps leading down into the dark. The same damp, stale air rushed up to greet me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I flicked on my flashlight and stepped down. The air grew thicker with each step, pressing in on me like I was wading through something unseen. The basement smelled of old wood and mildew, but underneath it was something else, something rotten. At the bottom of the stairs, I scanned the space. It was mostly empty. Just a few forgotten boxes, a rusted furnace, and a door. At the far end of the basement, half hidden by shadows, was a second door. One I had never noticed before. Something inside me screamed not to open it. But I had to. I reached out, fingers trembling, and twisted the knob. It opened easily, too easily. The smell hit me first. Decay. Rot. Like something had been left down here to die. The flashlight flickered as I stepped inside. And then, I saw it. The room was small, barely big enough to stand in. The walls were covered in scratches, long, desperate claw marks carved deep into the wood. And in the center, a chair, old, rotting, with rusted metal cuffs attached to the arms and legs. Restraints. This wasn't just a basement. It was a place where someone had been kept. Someone who had never left. The second I stepped closer, a rush of cold air slammed into me. The door slammed shut. The light went out. And then, in the darkness, a whisper, right against my ear. You shouldn't have come. I didn't think. I ran. I threw myself against the door, shoving it open so hard I stumbled into the basement, gasping. The temperature had dropped. The whole space felt different, the air thick with something unseen. I scrambled up the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. As I reached the top, I heard it. Footsteps, pounding up the stairs behind me. I didn't stop. I slammed the basement door shut, locked it, and backed away. The air was silent. No knocking, no whispering, but I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and walked out of that house for the last time. I don't remember locking the front door behind me. I don't even remember walking to my car. 1 second, I was inside that house, running from something I knew wasn't human. The next, I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The house loomed in the rearview mirror, its windows dark and empty. I sat there, frozen, staring at it, waiting, half expecting to see something standing at the window, watching me leave. But nothing moved. The house sat there, silent, like it had always been. I started the engine and tore out of the driveway. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to be anywhere else. I checked into a motel just outside town. It was one of those small, forgettable places with flickering neon signs and scratchy bed sheets. I didn't care. I just needed to feel safe. For the first time in weeks, I locked the door and actually believed it would keep something out. I sat on the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? Was it a ghost? A spirit? Something else? I kept replaying the moment in the basement, the scratches on the walls, the chair with restraints, the whisper in my ear. Someone had been kept there. Someone had died there. And whatever was in that house, it hadn't left. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. That breathing. Slow, deep, right next to me. The next morning, I knew I couldn't just let this go. I drove to the town library and started digging through old records, trying to find anything about that house. It had been built in the early 1900s, owned by a handful of families over the decades. But then, in the 1970s, a disappearance. A man in his late 30s lived in the house alone, no known family. One night, he just vanished. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, just gone. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the basement in the weeks leading up to it. Scraping, knocking. One even swore they heard screaming. The police investigated but found nothing. The case went cold. And the house? It sat empty for years before being sold again. I felt sick reading it. The scratches in the basement. The restraints on the chair. Had someone kept him there? Tortured him? Or had something else been holding him? And if so, had it ever let him go? I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. I didn't want to know anymore. I should have never gone back. But something in me wouldn't let it go. I drove back to the house just as the sun was setting. I told myself I wasn't going inside. I just needed to see it one last time. The driveway was exactly how I left it. The front door still locked. The windows still dark. Nothing had changed. But the second I stepped out of my car, I knew I had made a mistake. The air was wrong. Thicker. Charged. And then, as I stood there, staring at the house, the porch light turned on. By itself, I felt every hair on my body rise. And then, the front door creaked open. I didn't wait. I turned and ran back to my car, heart hammering against my ribs. The moment I slammed the door shut, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. A notification. A voicemail. No caller or ID. I pressed play, my breath caught in my throat. And then, that same voice. Low, ragged. You shouldn't have come back. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I peeled out of there, never looking back. That was the last time I ever saw that house. I left Lakewood that night and never returned. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't even sell the house. I just left it to rot. Whatever money I had put into it didn't matter anymore. There was no price worth staying. For weeks after, I felt like something was watching me. In motel rooms, in gas stations, even when I finally settled in a new city. It'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that if I turned over, it'd see a shadow standing at the foot of my bed. And sometimes, I heard it again. The breathing. Soft. Slow. Right next to me. I tried to convince myself it was just in my head. The stress. The fear. A trick of my mind, stuck replaying those final moments in that house over and over. But then, the dream started. Always the same. I was back in the basement. The air damp, the scent of rotting wood clinging to my skin. The walls covered in scratches, deeper than before, almost as if something had clawed its way out. And in the corner, that chair. Empty. Waiting. And then, I'd hear it. A whisper. Right behind me. You shouldn't have come back. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. And sometimes, just before I was fully awake, I swore I could still hear breathing in the room. I changed numbers, switched addresses, did everything I could to outrun it. But one night, months later, I got another voicemail. No caller ID. I hesitated before pressing play. The message was only 3 seconds long. At first, I thought it was static, but as I held the phone closer, listening carefully, I realized it wasn't static. It was breathing. Slow, steady, right into my ear. And then, a click. Silence! I was in my late 20s when I moved into that place, an old two-story house on the outskirts of a quiet town. It was a rental, cheaper than anything else I could find, and the owner seemed almost too eager to hand over the keys. It was just me at the time, no roommates, no pets, no distractions. I had recently gone through a rough breakup and wanted a fresh start, somewhere peaceful where I could focus on work and clear my head. The house itself wasn't in terrible condition, but it had that look, paint slightly peeling, floorboards that creaked no matter how lightly you stepped, windows that never fully shut. It had been vacant for a while, and the air inside carried a faint musty scent, like old books left in a damp basement. I spent the first few days cleaning, unpacking, and trying to make the place feel like home. The second floor had 2 bedrooms and a small office space, but I only used one of the rooms. The other? I left the door closed. Something about it felt off. At first, life in the house was normal. I worked from home, so my days were quiet, waking up early, making coffee, answering emails, and occasionally stepping out to grab groceries or clear my head with a walk. Nights were uneventful too. I'd cook dinner, watch something mindless on my laptop, and then head to bed. If anything, the house was too quiet. No noisy neighbors, no traffic sounds, just the occasional creak from the wooden frame settling. But as the days passed, I started to feel something I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't anything obvious, just an odd sensation, like being watched. I'd be typing away at my desk and feel like someone was standing behind me. The hairs on my arms would rise, and I'd turn quickly, expecting to see something. But the room would always be empty. Then came the noises. At first, they were small. A faint thump from upstairs when I knew I was alone. A soft rustling sound coming from the second floor while I was downstairs. I told myself it was just the house settling, the wind pushing against the old wooden walls. But then, one night, I heard something that I couldn't ignore. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone with the lights off, when I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the second floor. I sat up, holding my breath. The sound was unmistakable. Not the random pops and groans of an old house, but the weight of someone walking. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, hesitating for a moment before stepping out of bed. My heart was pounding. I forced myself to walk toward the stairs, shining my light up toward the second floor. Nothing. The hallway was empty, the doors to the rooms closed just as I had left them. But I swear, just as I turned to go back to bed, I heard it again, one single, heavy step, right above me. That was the first night I struggled to fall asleep in that house. And as the days went by, the feeling that I wasn't alone only grew stronger. I wasn't prepared for what was coming next. That first night of hearing footsteps above me wasn't something I could just shake off. I tried to tell myself it was my mind playing tricks on me, that maybe I was just adjusting to living alone in an old house. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. The next morning, I was more tired than usual. I had spent half the night listening, waiting, trying to convince myself I wouldn't hear anything else. By the time I finally got some sleep, it was already close to dawn. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming in through the blinds, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal again. I went through my usual morning routine, got out of bed, brushed my teeth, and made coffee. As I stood in the kitchen, letting the caffeine wake me up, I glanced toward the staircase leading to the second floor. The night before replayed in my mind, but now, in the daylight, it felt ridiculous. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe the sound had come from outside. But just as I took another sip of coffee, something made me stop. The door to the unused bedroom upstairs was open. I was sure, absolutely sure, that I had closed it when I moved in. It had stayed that way for days. I had no reason to go in there. The room was empty, unfurnished, and carried a strange chill that made me avoid it altogether. Yet there it was, slightly ajar. A pit formed in my stomach. I tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe I hadn't latched it all the way, and a draft had pushed it open. Maybe I had brushed against it the day before without realizing it. But even as I tried to reason with myself, I felt a creeping unease spread through me. I set my coffee down and walked up the stairs, each step making the old wood groan beneath my weight. When I reached the doorway, I hesitated before pushing the door fully open. The room was exactly how I remembered, bare, untouched, empty. But the air inside was noticeably colder than the rest of the house. I stepped in, scanning the walls, the floor, the corners. There was no sign of anything unusual. But then, just as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the dusty wooden floor near the far corner, there was a mark, a faint, uneven smudge in the dust, like something had been dragged. It wasn't large, but it was enough to make my pulse quicken. I crouched down, running my fingers across the floor. The dust was disturbed, but there were no clear footprints. No explanation for how it had happened. I stood up quickly, brushing my hands against my jeans. The room suddenly felt suffocating, like the air had thickened around me. I backed toward the door, pulling it shut with more force than necessary. This time, I made sure it latched. By the time I made it back downstairs, my hands were clammy. I told myself it was nothing, just a draft, just an old house shifting. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. I buried myself in work, kept the TV on in the background, and made an effort not to look toward the staircase. By evening, I almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. But then, that night, something else happened. I was lying in bed, trying to unwind, when I heard a noise, faint, almost imperceptible at first. It sounded like shuffling, a soft, dragging sound coming from the second floor. I froze, my ears straining. The noise stopped for a moment, and then 3 distinct knocks. Not from my front door, not from outside, from inside the house, from the second floor. My breath hitched. The sound had come from directly above me, the room I had made sure to close earlier that day. I stared at the ceiling, my pulse hammering in my ears. The knocks were slow, deliberate, spaced just far enough apart to make my skin crawl. I sat up, gripping my phone in one hand. I wanted to get up, to check, to do something, but my body felt locked in place. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone in the house? Had I left a window open? Was I losing my mind? Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the knocks stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I forced myself to breathe. I turned on my bedside lamp, casting weak, yellow light across the room. Everything looked normal, safe, but my gut told me otherwise. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every shift of the house made me flinch. I kept waiting to hear the sound again, but it never came. The next morning, I told myself I had imagined it. Stress, sleep deprivation, the power of suggestion. But then I went upstairs. The door to the unused room was open. Again. This time, I didn't step inside. I didn't even touch the door. I just stood there, staring at the empty space beyond the frame, feeling something invisible watching me back. Something was in this house, and it wanted me to know it. I tried to ignore it. I really did. After that second night, after finding the door open again, I forced myself to go about my day as if nothing had happened. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't check the room. I didn't even glance at the staircase unless I had to. If I ignored it, if I acted like it wasn't real, maybe it would stop. But it didn't stop. It got worse. The first real shift happened 3 nights later. I was exhausted, drained from the lack of sleep, and the gnawing tension I carried through the day. I crawled into bed earlier than usual, hoping sheer exhaustion would knock me out before my mind could wander. At first, it worked. I drifted into that half-asleep state, my body sinking into the mattress, my thoughts fuzzy and disjointed. Then I heard it. Breathing. Not mine. It was faint at first, just a soft exhale, like someone standing close, too close. My eyes snapped open, and my body went rigid. The room was dark, the only light coming from the weak glow of my phone screen on the nightstand. I held my breath, listening. There it was again. Slow, deliberate breathing. It wasn't coming from beside me. It was coming from above me. My ceiling. I couldn't move, couldn't blink. Every muscle in my body locked up as I stared at the ceiling, my mind screaming for an explanation. The air in the room felt thicker, pressing against my skin like a heavy fog. The breathing continued. Steady, patient. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I forced myself to check the second floor. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe some kind of logical answer, something to put my mind at ease. But as soon as I reached the top of the stairs, the temperature dropped. The hallway felt colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with a damp, musty scent. And then I noticed something new. The door to the unused bedroom was still open. But this time, there was something inside. Footprints. They trailed from the doorway to the center of the room, faint imprints in the dust. Bare footprints. I wasn't barefoot when I came up here before. I hadn't stepped into this room in days. And these weren't mine. I backed out of the room, shutting the door without stepping inside. I locked it this time, but it didn't matter. The next morning, the door was open again. I stopped sleeping in my room after that. I couldn't stand being under that ceiling, knowing that something had been breathing above me. I moved to the couch downstairs, leaving the TV on at low volume for background noise. It didn't help. A few nights later, I woke up to a faint noise. A tapping sound, light and rhythmic. At first, I thought it was coming from the front door, but as I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I realized it was coming from behind me. The window. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting into knots. There was something outside. At first, I couldn't see it clearly, just a faint shape against the darkness. But as my eyes adjusted, my chest tightened. A figure stood just beyond the glass, barely visible in the dim glow from the streetlight. Tall, still, watching. My breath caught in my throat. My hands gripped the blanket draped over me, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't move, didn't blink. Neither did it. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out any details. Just the outline of something standing there, pressed against the window as if waiting for me to react. Then it shifted. Not a normal shift. Not a person shifting weight from one foot to another. It flickered. For half a second, it wasn't there. Then it was. Then it wasn't. Like a glitch. Like something trying to hold itself together. And then, the tapping started again. Soft. Deliberate. I scrambled off the couch, heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to run, but my body refused to move beyond a few stumbling steps. My phone was on the coffee table, but I couldn't take my eyes off the window long enough to grab it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something else to happen. The silence pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. Finally, after what felt like forever, I forced myself to look away, to grab my phone. My fingers trembled as I unlocked the screen, my mind racing for what to do next. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. The next night, I locked every door, every window. I checked them twice, made sure they were shut tight. I kept the lights on, kept the TV on, kept the blanket wrapped around me like it could somehow keep me safe. I still didn't sleep. Sometime around 3 in the morning, just as my body was about to give in, I heard it. A voice. Not from outside. From upstairs. It was soft, low, just above a whisper. At first, I thought I was imagining it, my mind playing tricks on me from exhaustion. But then I heard it again. Clearer. Closer. I couldn't make out words, just the tone. Mocking. Waiting. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The bright beam cut through the darkness, shaking slightly in my unsteady grip. I forced myself to step forward, to move toward the staircase, my legs heavy with dread. The whispering stopped the second I set foot on the first step. I held my breath, waiting. Then, a loud bang from upstairs, like something heavy slamming against the floor. I bolted. I didn't look back, didn't check, didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the cold night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I sat on the porch until morning, my phone clutched in my hand, refusing to go back inside. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't done with me yet. I had reached my breaking point. The second floor, the open door, the breathing, the figure at the window, the whispers. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, it was real. Something was in that house, and I needed to know what it was. Or maybe, I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Either way, I couldn't keep running from it. I had a plan. I would go upstairs one last time. I would check the locked room, see what was inside, and if I found anything at all, I would leave. Permanently. I didn't care about breaking my lease. I didn't care if I had to sleep in my car. I just needed to know. I waited until nightfall. Not because I wanted to, but because I had spent the entire day sitting on my porch, staring at the house, trying to work up the nerve to go back in. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long across the street, I knew I had run out of time. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The house was silent. The air felt heavier than usual, pressing against my skin like something unseen was watching, waiting. I turned on every light as I made my way through the house, but no matter how bright the bulbs shone, the second floor remained dark. It was time. I took the first step. The wood creaked beneath my weight. I took another. Halfway up, the air turned colder. Not like an open window or faulty heating, this was unnatural. It bit at my skin, sank into my bones. My breath fogged in front of me. Another step. I could hear my own heartbeat hammering inside my chest. The silence was so thick it was suffocating. I gripped my phone tighter, flashlight beam shaking slightly in my trembling hand. Then I reached the top. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with closed doors. But my eyes locked on one. The door. The one that was always open, no matter how many times I closed and locked it. It was shut. A new kind of fear took hold. It had never been shut before. I reached for the knob, my fingers ice cold against the metal. I twisted. Locked! I took a step back, my pulse racing. That door was never locked. I didn't even have a key for it. Then, a noise from inside. A slow, deliberate scrape, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started. Silence! And then, 3 knocks. Not on the door. From inside the room. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of there, to not open that door. But something inside me snapped. I had spent too many nights being afraid. Too many hours letting this thing control me. I wasn't going to let it win. I lifted my foot and kicked the door open. The door swung inward with a loud bang. and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Rotten, damp, decay. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve as I stepped inside. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against my chest. The room was empty. No furniture, no windows, just bare walls and a wooden floor covered in dust. Except, not all of the floor was covered in dust. I shone my flashlight downward and my stomach twisted into knots. There were footprints, bare, human footprints, leading from the doorway to the center of the room. And they didn't belong to me. My breath hitched as I followed the trail with my eyes. They ended abruptly, right in the middle of the room. Like whoever made them had been standing there for a long time. And then they vanished. Not back toward the door, not toward the walls. They just stopped, as if whatever made them had simply disappeared. The air grew colder. My skin prickled. Then, a whisper, close, right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the dark. Nothing, just the empty hallway beyond the doorway. Then something moved. Not in front of me, not behind me. Above, my breath left my body in a silent gasp as I slowly tilted my head up. And I saw it. It clung to the ceiling like a spider, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Too long, too thin. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, the color of something long dead. But the worst part, it had no face, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin where features should have been. But I could feel it staring at me. A pressure, heavy and suffocating, pressed against my chest. My vision blurred at the edges. My body refused to move. Then, it dropped. I didn't have time to react. 1 second, it was on the ceiling. The next, it was right in front of me. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if studying me. Then, a sound, not a whisper, a breath. That same slow, deliberate breathing I had heard in my room, right against my ear. I finally found my voice and screamed. The escape. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the room, how I made it down the stairs. 1 second, I was frozen in terror. The next, I was sprinting toward the front door. The air around me felt thick, like I was running through water. The walls of the house seemed to stretch and warp, like the space itself was shifting. But I didn't stop. I reached the front door and threw it open. The second I crossed the threshold, the pressure lifted. The cold disappeared. The silence snapped. The house behind me was just a house again. Still, empty, waiting. I stood there, gasping for breath, staring at the open door. Then, slowly, it began to close. Not slamming, not violently, just closing, as if whatever was inside was done with me. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and left, the door clicking shut behind me. I never went back. I don't remember much after stepping off that porch. I walked, kept walking. My car was parked at the end of the driveway, but I didn't go to it. I didn't trust myself to drive. My hands were shaking, my breathing was uneven, and my legs felt weak, like they'd give out any second. So I just kept moving. The night air was warm, but I was freezing. The cold from that house clung to me, wrapping around my bones like a second skin. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake it, but it wouldn't go away. At some point, I found myself standing at a gas station down the road. I must be walked there on autopilot. The bright fluorescent lights hummed above me, buzzing in my ears. I could smell gasoline, fried food from the mini-mart, the stale scent of asphalt. Everything felt too real, like my senses were in overdrive, trying to make up for what I had just experienced. I went inside. The cashier, a guy maybe in his 50s. "Long night?" he asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was too dry. My mind still caught between that house and the real world. I grabbed a bottle of water and went to the counter. My hands shook as I pulled out my wallet. The guy didn't say anything else, but he didn't take his eyes off me. I paid, left, sat on the curb outside, and drank the whole bottle in a few gulps. It didn't help. Nothing did. Because no matter how much distance I put between myself and that house, I still felt like I wasn't alone. I didn't go back to the house. I left everything behind, my clothes, my furniture, my laptop, even my phone charger. I didn't care. I just got in my car and drove. At first, I told myself I'd go to a motel, get some rest, clear my head. But the further I got from that neighborhood, the better I felt. So I kept going. I drove until the sky started turning gray with morning light. Until the highway stretched empty in front of me, the past swallowed up behind me. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point, exhaustion won. I pulled into a rest stop, locked my doors, and closed my eyes. I thought I'd have nightmares. I didn't. But when I woke up, my body was sore and my mind felt hollow. Like something had been taken from me in my sleep. Like I had left a piece of myself in that house. It's been months since that night. I never went back. Never even drove past that neighborhood again. I don't know what happened to the house, if someone else moved in, if it still sits empty. I don't want to know. But here's the thing, it didn't end when I left. I told myself it would. That whatever was in that house was tied to that place. That as long as I never set foot inside again, it'd be fine. I was wrong. The first few weeks were the worst. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. Not from nightmares, because I felt something in the room with me. The air would get cold. The same suffocating pressure would settle over my chest. And then, the breathing. Slow, deliberate, right next to my bed. Every time it'd shoot up, gasping for air, scrambling to turn on the light. Nothing would be there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Some nights, I'd hear knocking, 3 soft, deliberate knocks on the inside of my closet door. Other nights, I'd wake up to find my bedroom door open. Wide open. No matter how many times I locked it before going to sleep. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was trauma, stress, anything but what I knew deep down to be true. I had left the house, but something had followed me. I tried to research the house. I wanted to know what happened there, who lived there before me, why it felt so wrong. But there was nothing. No history. No news articles, no record of anything bad ever happening there. It was like the house didn't exist before I moved in. That's when I realized something. It wasn't about the house. It was about me. I had seen it. It had seen me. And now, I don't think it's ever going to let me go. I don't talk about that house anymore. I don't tell people what happened. Not in detail, at least. If someone asks why I left so suddenly, why I abandoned everything I own, I just say, it didn't feel like home. That's not a lie. But it's not the whole truth either. The truth is, I don't think I was ever supposed to leave. I moved into a small apartment, far from that town, far from anyone who might ask too many questions. I kept the lights on at night. I never let my bedroom door stay open. I tried to convince myself I was fine, but deep down, I knew better. The signs never stopped. Sometimes, I'd wake up and feel it, that same heavy presence, watching, waiting. Other times, I'd glance at a mirror and swear for half a second that there was something else in the reflection. It never showed itself. Not fully, but it made sure I knew it was still there. I thought about getting help. A priest, a psychic, someone who might understand whatever had attached itself to me. But the more I read about things like this, the more I realized something. There might not be a way to get rid of it. Maybe I invited it in without realizing it. Maybe it had been waiting for someone like me, someone alone, someone easy to isolate. And maybe, just maybe, it enjoyed the chase. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it will ever go away. But I know one thing. I'll never be alone again. Because it won't let me be. And that's the worst part. Not the fear. Not the memories. The fact that I can feel it right now as I'm telling you this, standing just behind me. Watching. Waiting. For what? I don't know. But one day, I'm afraid I'll find out. At the time, I was living in a small town that didn't even have a stoplight. Just one of those places where everyone knows each other, where you recognize every car that passes by. I had just turned 30 and moved into a rental house on the outskirts of town, an old, creaky place that had probably been standing for 100 years. It wasn't anything special. 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, a living room with outdated wallpaper that had started peeling in the corners. It was cheap though. That was the only thing that mattered. I had been in that house for about 3 months when things started getting strange. At first, it was little things, misplaced objects, doors that I could have sworn I closed being slightly ajar when I came back into the room. But I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. I had a bad habit of getting distracted, setting my phone down in one spot, and then swearing I had left it somewhere else entirely. Back then, my life was quiet, almost boring. I worked nights at a security job about 20 minutes away. The schedule wasn't ideal, but it paid the bills, and I actually liked driving home in the early hours of the morning. There was something peaceful about it, that eerie stillness when the whole town was asleep. Most nights after work, I'd stop by the gas station for coffee before heading home. The old man behind the counter always greeted me with a nod, handing over my usual without me even needing to ask. I liked the routine, the predictability of it all. When I wasn't working, I spent most of my time at home, either watching movies or scrolling through my phone. I didn't have a lot of friends in town, so my social life was pretty much non-existent. My only real visitor was my sister, who would drop by every now and then to check on me. She worried too much, always asking if I was eating properly, if I had met anyone new, if I ever planned on moving closer to the city again. I always gave her the same answers. Yes, I was eating fine. No, I hadn't met anyone. And no, I wasn't moving back. I liked the quiet. Or at least, I thought I did. Looking back, I realize now that the house had always felt off. Not in any obvious way. But there was something about it, something in the air, as if the walls had been soaking up years of secrets. I didn't pay much attention at first. I had lived in old houses before. Creaking floorboards, drafts that made the curtains move even when the windows were shut. That was just part of the package. But then, there was the door. It was in the hallway, right between the 2 bedrooms. Just a plain wooden door, painted white, slightly scuffed at the bottom. The landlord had mentioned it when I first moved in, saying it led to a small storage room. Nothing special. I had no reason to question it. I should have questioned it. For the first few months, everything seemed normal. Or at least, nothing stood out enough to make me feel uneasy. I had settled into my routine, work, coffee, home. The creaky floors and drafty windows were just background noise, things I barely noticed anymore. But then, something changed. It started with small things. One night, after getting home from my shift, I kicked off my boots by the door like I always did. I was exhausted, running on nothing but caffeine and whatever gas station snack I had picked up. I remember walking straight to my bedroom without even bothering to turn on the lights. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of the old wooden beam settling. I had only been in bed for maybe 5 minutes when I heard a soft, quiet click. I sat up. The sound had come from the hallway. At first, I thought it was nothing. Maybe the house shifting, maybe the wind pushing against one of the doors. But as I sat there, barely breathing, I realized something. The hallway door, the one leading to the so-called storage room, had been shut when I got home. I was sure of it. I hadn't used that room once since moving in. The landlord told me it was just a small space, probably no bigger than a closet. I had no reason to go in there, and honestly, I had sort of forgotten it even existed. But as I sat there in the dark, staring at my bedroom door, I knew I had heard it open. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet pressing against the cold floor. The air felt heavier than usual, thick, like the way it feels right before a thunderstorm. I reached for my phone, using the screen's glow to light my way as I stepped into the hallway. The door was open. Just slightly, barely a few inches, but open enough for me to see the darkness beyond it. I felt a prickle crawl up the back of my neck. I knew I had closed it. I took a step closer, holding my breath as I reached out and pressed my palm against the wood. It wasn't stuck, wasn't heavy, just an ordinary door. With a quiet push, I shut it again, making sure I heard the soft click as it latched. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant sound of a car passing by on the main road. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had left it open without realizing. Maybe the air pressure from opening my bedroom door had caused it to shift. There were 100 possible explanations, none of which involved anything supernatural. So I went back to bed. But I didn't sleep. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything dramatic, just small things. My keys weren't where I had left them. The remote would be on the couch 1 second and on the coffee table the next. At first, I blamed it on exhaustion. Working nights messed with my head sometimes, made me forget things, made my memory feel unreliable. But the door kept opening, always at night. The first few times, I convinced myself I had left it unlatched. But by the 5th time, I knew that wasn't the case. So I started testing it. Before going to bed, I would double-check the door, even pulling on it to make sure it was fully shut. Then, sometime between midnight and dawn, I would hear it. That soft, unmistakable click. Every single time, it was open just a few inches. Never more, never less. It was enough to make my stomach twist. One night, I even stacked a couple of showboxes in front of it. Just to see. Just to prove to myself that it wasn't actually opening on its own. When I woke up, the showboxes were moved. Not knocked over, not tipped, just moved. As if someone had carefully pushed them aside to open the door. That was the first time I felt something close to fear. I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself, but the reality was becoming harder to ignore. Either someone was coming into my house at night, or something else was. I hated both options. A week later, I had my first real scare. It was around 2 a.m. I had just gotten home, the drive from work feeling longer than usual. I remember standing in the kitchen, drinking water straight from the tap, when I felt it, something behind me. Not a sound, not a shadow, just that strange, primal feeling of being watched. Slowly, I turned my head toward the hallway. The door was open. This time, wider than before. I hadn't even gone near it, hadn't even checked it when I walked in. But there it was, wide enough for someone, something, to step through. And then, the worst part. The air in the hallway shifted, like something moving. Like a breath. I froze. For a split second, I considered running, just grabbing my keys and getting the hell out. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I took a step forward, my pulse hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My phone was still in my pocket, but I didn't reach for it. I was afraid that if I moved too fast, whatever was standing in that doorway would move too. The hallway light was dim, casting long shadows against the walls. I kept my eyes locked on the open door, barely breathing. And then I saw it. Not a person. Not exactly. Just the shape of something standing in the darkness, too still, too silent. The pressure in my chest grew heavier. I wanted to blink, to look away for even a second, but I was terrified that if I did, it would be closer. Then, click, the door swung shut. On its own. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the closed door, my body refusing to move. The house was silent again, but it wasn't normal silence. It was the kind that made my skin prickle, the kind that felt wrong. Eventually, I forced myself to move, stepping backward into my bedroom and locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night, and I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone in that house. After that night, nothing felt the same. The house wasn't just unsettling anymore, it was suffocating. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak in the floor felt intentional, every quiet moment felt wrong. I had spent weeks convincing myself that it was just paranoia, that the strange incidents could be explained away. But I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Something was in that house with me. And it wasn't just watching. It was waiting. The first few nights after the door shut on its own, I refused to go near it. I locked my bedroom door, stuffed a towel under the gap, and left every light on. But the lights didn't help. Nothing did. Because no matter what I did, I would wake up to that same click. The door opening. Sometimes I would hear soft movement outside my room. Not footsteps, not exactly, just the barely perceptible sound of something shifting, something moving just beyond my reach. I started keeping my phone in my hand at all times, but whenever I tried to record or take a picture, nothing showed up. The audio would just be static, or worse, pure silence. I was exhausted. Work became a blur. My coworkers started asking if I was okay. I made up excuses: bad sleep, stress, too much caffeine. But inside, I felt like I was unraveling. And then, things escalated. It wasn't just the door anymore. It was everything. One night, I came home late and walked straight into the kitchen. My fridge had one of those cheap plastic magnets stuck to it, the kind that came with a local pizzeria's phone number. I didn't even glance at it. I just opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and turned to leave. But something made me stop. The magnet. It was on the floor. I stared at it, my fingers tightening around the water bottle. Maybe it had just fallen. Maybe the adhesive was bad. But then, as I watched, it slid, just an inch, but enough for me to see it move. My stomach twisted. I backed away slowly, stepping into the living room. I didn't know what I was looking for, but every part of me was on high alert. And then, from the hallway, click, the door. My breath hitched, and I turned toward it, heart hammering. But this time, it wasn't just open. It was wide open. A cold rush of air spilled out from the darkened space beyond it, carrying with it a scent I couldn't quite place. Not rotting, not foul, just wrong. I forced myself to move closer. As I stepped toward the open doorway, the light in the hallway flickered. My own shadow stretched unnaturally across the wooden floor, twisting in a way that made my skin prickle. I reached for the door handle. Something breathed right next to me. I felt it, warm, damp air against my ear. I spun around, my back slamming into the wall, my pulse thundering in my ears. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty. I grabbed the door and slammed it shut. This time, I locked it. But deep down, I knew locks didn't matter. Not anymore. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat up in bed, my back pressed against the headboard, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sensation of something touching my foot. Not a hard grip, not a tug, just the lightest brush of fingertips. I jerked my leg back so fast I nearly fell off the bed. My heart was racing, my breath ragged. I grabbed my phone and switched on the flashlight, sweeping it across the room. Nothing. I stared at my blankets, the same ones I had tucked around myself before falling asleep. They were folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Too neatly. As if someone had carefully smoothed them out while I was sleeping. I didn't go back to sleep after that. The next morning, I started looking for answers. I wasn't the kind of person who bought into ghost stories, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I started researching the house. It took some digging, but I finally managed to track down an old article from the town's archives. It wasn't a headline story, just a brief mention, an incident that had happened over 20 years ago. A man had gone missing. Not just missing, he had vanished inside the house. The article was vague, but from what I gathered, he had been renting the place, much like I was. One day, his co-workers reported that he hadn't shown up for work. Police checked the house, but there was no sign of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The only thing they found was his car still parked in the driveway, his keys on the kitchen counter, and his bedroom door wide open, just like mine. There was no follow-up article, no explanation. It was like he had simply ceased to exist. And the worst part? The date of his disappearance. The exact same day I had moved in. I shut my laptop, my hands clammy. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of that house. But something inside me whispered that it wouldn't be that easy. Because whatever had happened to that man, whatever had taken him, it wasn't done yet. And it was getting stronger. By the time night fell, I was ready to leave. I didn't care about the lease, my deposit, or whether I would have to crash at a friend's place until I figured things out. I just knew I couldn't spend another night in that house. But as I packed a bag, the air in the house shifted. It was subtle at first. A drop in temperature, the kind that seeps into your bones. But then, the silence became something else, thicker, heavier, like the walls themselves were listening. The house knew, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. I had planned to leave as soon as I finished packing. But as I zipped up my bag, I heard it. Click. That damn door. It had unlocked itself again. I froze, staring at the door frame. This time, I hadn't touched it, hadn't gone near it. And yet, the lock had turned on its own. The door creaked open, just an inch. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't going to check. Not this time. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and my phone, and I headed straight for the front door. But as I reached for the knob, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. My breath fogged in front of me. Then, boom! The sound exploded from the back of the house, shaking the walls. It wasn't thunder, wasn't the sound of something falling. It was deeper, more final. And then, the smell hit me. That same scent from before, the one that made my stomach twist. But now, it was overwhelming, stale, damp, mixed with something almost metallic. It was coming from the open door. I turned, and for the first time since moving in, I saw it. The doorway was no longer just an opening. It was black. Not just dark, absence of light, a void that seemed to swallow the hallway beyond it. And inside that void, something moved. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows. But then I saw the shape, tall, wrong, its outline shifting like it wasn't fully solid. And then it stepped forward. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. It had no face, no eyes, just a hollow, gaping space where its features should have been. And yet, I felt it looking at me. Something in my brain screamed to run, but my body wouldn't move. The shape twitched, its head tilting unnaturally to the side, like it was studying me. Then, it rushed me. The blackness swallowed the space between us in an instant. I felt the cold wrap around my body, the air crushing against my chest. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to die. But then, as quickly as it came, it stopped. I collapsed to the floor, gasping. The air felt thick, wrong. And that's when I heard it. A voice. Not a whisper, not a murmur, something that felt like it was being spoken directly into my skull. Stay! It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. I scrambled backward, dragging myself away. My limbs felt sluggish, like I was moving through water. The thing didn't follow. It just stood there, its hollow face tilted slightly, waiting. I don't remember how I got to my feet. I don't remember how I made it out the front door. All I know is that the second I crossed the threshold, the air snapped back to normal. The heaviness, the cold, it was gone. But I knew one thing for certain. I hadn't escaped. Not really. Because as I looked back at the house, the door was still open. And inside the darkness, I felt it watching. I don't remember much about the drive. Somehow, I got into my car. Somehow, I turned the key. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly snapped it off in the ignition, but I drove. I don't even remember which direction I went, just that I needed to put distance between myself and that house. By the time I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of town, my body finally caught up with my mind. My stomach twisted, my hands were numb, and a violent shiver ran through me. I barely managed to stumble into the bathroom before I threw up. When I finally lifted my head, my reflection in the mirror barely looked like me. My face was pale, my eyes sunken, and there was a smear of something dark on my hoodie. Dust? Dirt? I didn't know. But there was something else. A feeling, like the weight of eyes on the back of my skull. Even out here, miles away from that house, I still felt watched. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, trying to convince myself to call someone. I had friends, co-workers, hell, even my landlord. But what would I say? Hey, I had a full-blown breakdown because my spare room is haunted. Can I crash at your place? I couldn't do it. Instead, I scrolled through my phone, searching for something, anything that could explain what I had seen. Ghost stories, paranormal encounters, sleep paralysis, but nothing fit. Because whatever was in that house wasn't just a shadow in the corner of my vision. It wasn't just a creak in the night or the feeling of unease. It was real. It had moved toward me. And worst of all, it had spoken. As I sat there, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't have answered. But something in me, the same part that had survived that house, said to pick up. I swiped to accept. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, a voice. Not robotic. Not aggressive. Just tired. You left, didn't you? I nearly dropped the phone. Who is this? My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. A pause. Then, doesn't matter. Just listen. You need to stay gone. Do not, the voice cut out. A burst of static filled the speaker. And then, before I could say another word, the call ended. I stared at the screen, heart hammering. I tried to call back. No response. The number didn't even show up in my call log. It was like it had never happened. I should have listened. I should have left town. But there was one problem. My stuff was still in that house. Laptop, clothes, documents. everything I owned. And no matter how terrified I was, I couldn't just walk away from my entire life. So the next morning, I did the stupidest thing I've ever done. I went back. The house looked exactly the same as I had left it. The door was still shut, the windows still dark, but they felt different, like it knew I was there. I hesitated at the front steps, gripping my keys so hard they bit into my palm. My body screamed at me to turn around, to forget whatever was inside. But I needed my stuff. I took a breath, stepped forward, and as soon as my foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. The air inside was thick, suffocating. My ears popped. My vision blurred at the edges. And then, from deep inside the house, a whisper, not in my head, not from a phone, from the hallway. I told you to stay. The lights flickered. The floor beneath me shifted. And in the darkness of the open doorway at the end of the hall, it was waiting. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air around me thickened, pressing against my skin like a weight. My limbs felt slow, heavy, like I was sinking into the floor. I needed to run. I needed to move, but my body refused. Then, a crash. Somewhere upstairs, something shattered. The noise snapped me out of whatever grip the house had on me. I turned, lunged for the front door, and wrenched it open. But as I crossed the threshold, something grabbed me. Not physically, not with hands, but with a pressure so overwhelming that for a split second, I felt like I was being pulled back inside. I screamed, stumbling onto the front porch. The grip released. And then, just like that, the house was still. The door stood open behind me, but the darkness inside was deeper now, hungrier. I backed away, barely able to breathe, and for the first time, I saw it standing in the doorway. Not fully formed, not solid, but present, watching, waiting. I didn't stop to think. I ran. I got into my car, sped down the street, nearly taking out my neighbor's mailbox. I didn't look back, and I never went back again. I broke my lease over the phone. My landlord wasn't happy, but I didn't care. I told him he could keep my stuff, burn it, sell it, whatever he wanted. I wasn't stepping foot in that house again. For weeks, I crashed on friends' couches, barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, felt its presence. Even now, after all this time, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, the room too quiet. Like something is waiting for me to come back. And the worst part, I still dream about that house. But in the dreams, the door is always open. I moved to a new place across town. A small apartment, nothing fancy, but safe. No strange noises, no shifting shadows, no voices creeping through the walls. At least, that's what I tell myself. For a while, I tried to convince myself that none of it had been real. Maybe I had been exhausted, stressed, or hallucinating. Maybe I had let my mind get the best of me. That's what normal people would believe, right? But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I know the truth. That house wasn't empty. Something was inside it, and it's still there. I never told anyone the full story. What would I even say? Hey, I rented a haunted house, and it tried to keep me there forever. It sounded insane, but I couldn't let it go completely. Late at night, I found myself searching for anything about the house, old records, previous owners, unexplained deaths. I found nothing. No murders, no disappearances, just a long history of people moving in and leaving within a year. No explanations, no complaints on record, just gone, like they had the same experience I did, or worse. Even though I left, something still feels wrong. Some nights I wake up gasping, my sheets damp with sweat, convinced that I heard a voice. Not loud, not clear, just a breath of sound, like someone whispering my name from a distance. And sometimes, when I check my phone in the morning, I see missed calls from an unknown number. No voicemail, no trace in my call log, but I know what I heard. It was the summer of 2018 when I moved into the old villa. I had just turned 28, recently left a job I hated, and decided to take some time for myself. The city had become suffocating, crowded streets, honking cars, and an endless cycle of stress. So when I saw a listing for a quiet, secluded house in the countryside, I didn't hesitate. The villa was about 100 years old, standing alone at the edge of a thick forest. The price was unbelievably low for what it was: 2 floors, an attic, a large basement, and a massive backyard. The real estate agent, an older man with tired eyes, seemed almost eager to hand me the keys. "People don't stay here long," he muttered under his breath. But when I asked what he meant, he just shrugged and said, "You'll see." At the time, I brushed it off. Old houses always had their quirks. I was more focused on the idea of peace, long walks, reading by the fireplace, and sleeping without the sound of sirens outside my window. The first few days were everything I had hoped for. The air smelled cleaner than anything in the city. Mornings were quiet, except for birds chirping. Nights were dark, completely silent, the kind of silence that made you aware of every small sound in the house: a creak, a soft tap, the wind rattling the windows. The villa itself had a certain charm. The walls were made of old, solid stone, paint peeling in places, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. Wooden floors groaned under my steps, and the furniture left behind was antique but well maintained. I only had to bring a few of my own things: a mattress, some clothes, my laptop, and a couple of books. One of the more interesting parts of the house was the basement. Unlike the rest of the villa, it was oddly modern looking, as if it had been renovated more recently. The walls were made of smooth concrete, and the floor was cold, polished stone. There were metal shelves along the walls, mostly empty, except for a few rusted tools and a couple of old, yellowed newspapers. I figured the previous owner must have used it for storage. I barely spent any time down there. It had a strange atmosphere, colder than the rest of the house. But aside from that, everything seemed perfectly normal. My days quickly fell into a routine. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and sit on the porch as the sun rose over the forest. I spent my afternoons fixing up the house, cleaning, painting, replacing old bulbs, and sealing cracks in the walls. At night, I would watch movies on my laptop, or sometimes just sit in the dim light of the fireplace, listening to the wind outside. The nearest town was about 15 miles away, and I only went there for groceries once a week. The locals were friendly, but distant, like they weren't used to outsiders staying for long. An old man at the general store asked me which house I had moved into, and when I told him, he just nodded slowly and said, "Brave man." It was a little unsettling, but I chalked it up to small-town superstitions. Every old place had its stories. The only thing that truly bothered me about the house was one particular room on the second floor. The door was locked when I moved in, and no key had been given to me. At first, I figured it was just an old storage space, nothing important. But every time I walked past it, something about it felt off. The wood was darker than the rest of the doors, almost like it had been burned. The handle was ice cold, no matter how warm the rest of the house was. And the strangest thing? At night, I swore I could hear faint scratching coming from inside. I told myself it was just my imagination. Old houses made weird noises. But something about that door made the air feel thicker, like the space around it didn't belong to the rest of the house. Still, I had no intention of messing with it. I wasn't the kind of person who went prying into locked doors. I told myself if the house wanted to keep something hidden, I wasn't about to argue. For the first week, nothing truly disturbing happened. Just the occasional odd sound here and there. A creak where there shouldn't have been one. A cold draft from seemingly nowhere. But then, on the seventh night, something changed. And that's when things started getting strange. The seventh night in the villa was when the silence changed. I had settled into my usual routine, a late dinner, a movie on my laptop, and then bed. The house was still, aside from the occasional groan of the old wooden frame adjusting to the cool night air. The wind outside was barely a whisper, and the forest beyond the backyard stood like a black wall under the moonlight. It was just past 2 a.m. when I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. There hadn't been a loud noise or a sudden movement, just this unnerving sense of awareness that dragged me out of sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house was silent. No wind, no creaking, just a heavy stillness pressing against my ears. And then, there it was. A soft, scratching sound. It was faint, almost delicate, like fingernails dragging lightly against a wooden surface. At first, I thought it was coming from the window, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But as I sat up and listened more closely, I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. More specifically, from the locked room. I stayed in bed, heartbeat pounding in my ears. The scratching continued in slow, deliberate strokes. Not frantic, not random. Just a steady, methodical movement against the wood. I told myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a raccoon had somehow gotten trapped inside. That was logical. That made sense. But something about the rhythm of it. It felt too intentional. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. I sat there, waiting. Nothing. The air in the room felt heavier, like the pressure had shifted. Even in the dark, I could feel the shape of the house around me, the hallway beyond my door, the staircase leading down, and that room at the end of the hall, sitting there in silence. I wanted to ignore it, roll over, and force myself back to sleep. But my curiosity, or maybe something else, wasn't going to let that happen. So I got out of bed. I moved slowly, feet barely making a sound against the old floorboards. As I stepped into the hallway, the air felt colder than it should have been. My arms prickled with goosebumps. The locked room was at the far end of the hall. The door stood there, silent, waiting. I hesitated, staring at it in the dim light from the moon filtering through the hallway window. The cold metal handle looked almost wet, slick with some kind of condensation. I raised a hand just to touch the wood, to see if it was as cold as it looked. But before I could, a single, sharp knock came from inside. I froze. Not scratching, not creaking. A knock. Soft, controlled, as if someone was standing right behind the door, waiting for me to respond. I did what any sane person would do. I turned around and went straight back to my room, locked the door, and got under the covers like a child. Sleep was impossible after that. I kept my ears open, waiting for another sound, another sign that I hadn't imagined it. But nothing else happened for the rest of the night. By morning, in the daylight, it was easier to dismiss what I had heard. I told myself it was the house settling, that maybe my half-asleep mind had exaggerated the sound. But something felt different. The air inside the house didn't feel as welcoming as it had before. The quiet no longer felt peaceful, it felt watchful. Over the next few days, little things started happening. I'd wake up to find cabinet doors open in the kitchen when I was sure I had closed them. Footsteps in the hallway when I knew I was alone. One evening, I came back from a grocery run to find that the front door was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it when I left, but there it was, slightly ajar, like someone had just stepped inside and forgotten to close it properly. I searched the whole house, checking every room. Nothing was missing. Nothing seemed disturbed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside while I was gone. One night, while brushing my teeth in the upstairs bathroom, I saw movement in the mirror. At first, I thought it was just my reflection shifting. But then I realized the movement didn't match mine. A shadow passed by the bathroom door, just outside in the hallway. A human-shaped silhouette, tall and slow-moving. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway, empty as always. I checked every room, including the basement. All the doors were locked. The windows were shut tight. I was alone. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. By this point, sleep was a struggle. I was exhausted, on edge, and I needed answers. That's when I remembered the basement. I had barely explored it since moving in. The modern renovations, the clean walls, it felt out of place compared to the rest of the house. Something about it had always bothered me. So, one afternoon, I went down there with a flashlight, determined to at least understand why it felt so different. The air was thick, cold. The stone floor sent a chill up my spine as I stepped deeper inside. The metal shelves stood empty and quiet, their rusted surfaces untouched for years. But then I noticed something odd. The wall at the far end of the basement, it looked different. Unlike the other smooth, gray concrete walls, this one had faint marks on it. Scratches. Long, uneven grooves etched into the surface, like someone had been trying to claw through. And then, as I ran my fingers over the rough texture, I felt it, a hollow spot. I knocked against it, and the sound was off, like there was empty space behind it. Something was hidden inside that wall, and whatever it was, it didn't want to stay hidden anymore. Standing in that basement, staring at the hollow spot in the wall, I felt it. A shift. It wasn't just unease anymore. It wasn't just paranoia creeping at the edges of my thoughts. This was real. Something was inside that wall. I took a step back, flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The scratches on the surface, they were deliberate. The uneven grooves, the jagged indentations. It wasn't from rats. Someone had been trying to break through from the inside. That night, I could barely keep my eyes open, but I didn't want to sleep. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting, listening. It was just past 2 a.m. when it happened again. The scratching. But this time, it was louder. Not faint, like before. Not soft, calculated strokes. This was desperate, aggressive. A dragging, scraping noise that made my skin crawl. I shot upright in bed, heart pounding. The sound was coming from the hallway again, the locked room. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped out of my room. The hallway stretched before me, long and dark, except for the pale glow of my light reflecting off the wooden floor. I took slow steps forward, breathing shallow. The air felt heavy. Then, something happened that made me stop cold. The scratching stopped. And then, the doorknob of the locked room turned. It was slow, deliberate. I stood there, frozen, watching as the handle twisted just enough for the door to creak. It wasn't locked anymore. I should have turned back. I should have gone to bed, pretended none of this was happening. But I didn't. I stepped closer, hand outstretched, and pushed the door open. The room was pitch black. My flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows, revealing only bits and pieces, the wooden floor, the dust swirling in the air. Then, my light landed on something in the corner. A figure. It was curled up, hunched, facing the wall. The moment the light touched it, it moved. A slow, unnatural twist of its head. I felt a cold rush of panic flood my veins as I stumbled back. The figure didn't stand. It didn't lunge. It only turned its head toward me, just enough for me to see its face. Or rather, the lack of one. A blank, smooth surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Then, without a sound, it began to rise. I ran. I slammed the door shut behind me and bolted down the hall, straight into my room. Locked the door. Pressed my back against it. And then, silence. No footsteps. No scratching. No sound at all. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. For a brief moment, I thought maybe I had hallucinated everything. That stress, exhaustion, and isolation had made my mind play tricks on me. But then I checked the hallway. The locked door, it was open. And I knew this was real. I needed answers. I spent the entire day digging through old records, town archives, anything I could find. The villa had been standing for over 100 years. It had gone through multiple owners, some of whom had disappeared without explanation. But one entry stood out. A family had lived there in the 1940s. A husband and wife. No children, or at least none that were documented. Except for one strange report, a missing persons case filed in 1948. A woman had contacted authorities, claiming her husband had vanished inside the house. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just gone. What was even more disturbing, the basement had been sealed off shortly after. I went back down to the basement, flashlight in hand. This time, I wasn't just observing. I grabbed a hammer, and I started breaking through the wall. The concrete was old, brittle. With each swing, the air in the room seemed to shift. The atmosphere grew thick, almost suffocating. Then, finally, a chunk of the wall gave way, revealing a dark, empty space behind it. I shined my flashlight inside, and I saw it. A crude wooden door stood at the back of the hidden space. It had scratches all over it, deep and erratic. Someone had been trapped inside. Or worse, something had been kept inside. I reached for the handle, fingers trembling. And then, bang! A deafening knock from the other side. Not a normal knock, not human. It was furious, animalistic. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The sound echoed through the basement, reverberating off the walls. The air turned ice cold. I grabbed the flashlight and ran. Whatever was inside that wall, inside that door, it wasn't meant to be let out. That night, I barricaded my room. I sat on the bed, gripping my phone, unable to shake the feeling that something was moving through the house. I could hear it, soft footsteps in the hallway. Slow, measured, and then, right outside my door, breathing. Not normal breathing. Not from a human. It was raspy, uneven, like something struggling to fill its lungs. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. Then, the doorknob twisted. The lock held. For hours, I stayed like that, listening, waiting, praying the sun would rise. And when it finally did, when the golden light filled the room, the breathing was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. Because the basement door, it was wide open. The basement door should not have been open. I had locked it. I was sure of it. Yet there it stood, slightly ajar, the darkness behind it stretching like an open mouth. A deep, gnawing fear rooted itself in my chest. Something had come out. I grabbed my flashlight, my breath shallow, and stepped forward. My fingers barely brushed the door before. Bang! A sound exploded from the basement below. A single earth-shaking impact. Like something had thrown itself against the hidden door behind the wall. I staggered back, the wooden floor creaking beneath me. Silence. Then, slowly, I heard the knocking. 1, 2, 3. Loud, rhythmic, demanding. Something wanted out. I don't know what compelled me to move. I should have left. I should have grabbed my keys, run outside, and never looked back. But something about that knocking, it was almost human. I took careful steps down the basement stairs, flashlight trembling in my grip. The deeper I went, the colder the air became. A smell hit me, earthy, damp, and something else, something rotten. At the bottom, the broken section of the wall loomed ahead. The wooden door inside the hidden space stood still. Except now, I could see it clearly. It wasn't just scratched. It had marks carved into it. Words. I shined my light across the surface, trying to make sense of them. Let me out. Over and over, covering the entire door. Carved in jagged, desperate strokes. I reached out, my fingers grazing the door handle. And then, the handle turned on its own. The breath left my body. I stepped back as the knob twisted violently, rattling, shaking. Then, bang. The door slammed forward, not open. Something had thrown itself against it from the other side. I swallowed, my throat dry, and forced myself to speak. Hello? Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Then, a whisper, right against the wood. Help me. I stumbled back, choking on my breath. It wasn't just the words. It was the voice. It sounded exactly like mine. The thing behind the door. Panic surged through my body. My legs screamed at me to run, but my mind couldn't process what was happening. I had to see. I had to know what was in there. With a deep breath, I gripped the handle and pulled. The door didn't open. Something on the other side held it shut. Then, in the beam of my flashlight, I saw it. A crack. Small, just barely between the door and the frame. I leaned forward, angling the light, trying to see inside. And then, an eye. Wide, staring, pressed against the gap. It wasn't a normal eye. The pupil was too large, the white too dark. And then, it blinked. I jerked back, a scream caught in my throat. The knocking started again, faster, furious. Bang, bang, Bang! The entire basement shook. And then, in one horrifying instant, the door burst open. The thing inside stepped forward. I don't know how to describe it. It had my height, my shape, but its skin, it was stretched too tight. Its features distorted, like someone had tried to sculpt a person and failed. Its mouth, it didn't move. But I heard it. Help me. My own voice. Perfectly copied. My mind snapped. I turned and ran. I sprinted up the stairs, my legs burning. The thing's footsteps thundered behind me. Not running, not walking, dragging. I reached the top, slammed the basement door shut, locked it, and then, from the other side, silence. A final message. I backed away, gasping for breath, waiting, listening, but nothing came. The house was still. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, sitting against the door, flashlight gripped in my hands. And as the hours passed, I noticed something. A sound. Not scratching, not knocking. A faint whisper. Over and over. 3 words. Let me out. I stayed by the basement door until the sun came up. Every minute felt like an hour, my back pressed against the wood, my hands gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't dare move. The whispering had stopped sometime during the night, but I couldn't bring myself to believe it was gone. It was waiting for me to make a mistake. As the first light of morning seeped through the windows, I forced myself to breathe. I had to leave. I pushed myself up, every muscle in my body protesting. I needed my keys, my phone, my bag. I glanced toward the front door, measuring the distance. I could make it, if I moved fast. But then, a sound, not from the basement, from behind me, a soft creak from the living room. I turned slowly. The house was still, the air thick. I stepped forward, my pulse hammering. The floorboards groaned beneath me, but nothing else moved. Then I saw it. The mirror. The one above the fireplace. And in its reflection, a figure, standing just behind me. My breath stopped. I spun around, but nothing. I looked back at the mirror. It was gone. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The room felt wrong, the air charged with something unseen. And then, the whisper. Close. Right next to my ear. Let me out. I ran. I grabbed my keys from the counter, threw open the door, and didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, tearing away from that house. As I sped down the empty road, my mind raced. What was that thing? Had it been trapped behind that door all along? Had I let it out? I didn't have answers. I didn't want them. All I knew was I could never go back. I drove straight to a motel, paid in cash, and locked myself in the room. Sleep didn't come easy. Every noise made my heart jump. Every shadow in the corner of my eye made my skin crawl. But the house was far behind me, or so I thought. At around 3 a.m., my phone vibrated. A notification. A message from my own number. 3 words. Let me out. I stared at my phone screen, my body frozen. The message was impossible. I hadn't texted myself. I hadn't given my number to anyone. There was no way this could be happening. And yet, there it was. Let me out. My hands trembled as I locked the phone and threw it on the bed like it had burned me. I couldn't do this anymore. I had run. I had left that house behind. But it hadn't let me go. Over the next few days, I did everything I could to put distance between myself and whatever had happened in that house. I rented a new place, a small apartment in the city, surrounded by people, by noise. No more empty houses. No more silent nights. I changed my number, got a new phone, tossed the old one into a dumpster. For a while, it worked. Nothing happened. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I had escaped. Then, about a week later, I woke up in the middle of the night. Something felt off. The air in my apartment was thick, heavy, like the air before a storm. And then, a sound, soft, faint, coming from the closet. I sat up slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pointed it at the closet door. It was open, just an inch. My throat clenched. I had closed it before bed. I knew I had. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I climbed out of bed, stepped forward, and paused. There, on the closet door, carved into the wood, 3 words: "Let me out." I don't know what followed me from that house. I don't know if it was ever really trapped, or if I was the one it had been waiting for. All I know is, no matter where I go, it's still with me. And sooner or later, it's going to get out. This is a story I never wanted to tell. Even now, years later, thinking about it makes my stomach twist. But if I don't say it out loud, it almost feels like I'm pretending it never happened. And that's the thing, I know it happened. Every moment of it is burned into my memory, no matter how much I wish it wasn't. It all started when I moved into a house that should have been perfect. It wasn't anything fancy, just a 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of a quiet town. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where the loudest noise at night is the occasional car passing by. It had been sitting empty for a while before I found it. The landlord said the last tenant left in a hurry, but didn't go into detail. At the time, I figured it was some personal issue, maybe a breakup or a job relocation. I didn't ask too many questions. I moved in during the fall. The air had that crisp bite to it, and the leaves in the yard were just starting to turn. The house itself was old but well kept. It had creaky wooden floors, a small but functional kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. The bedroom was at the end of a short hallway, with a single window facing the backyard. The second bedroom, which I didn't need, was mostly empty except for an old wooden dresser the landlord hadn't bothered to remove. At first, everything felt normal. I settled into a routine, work during the day, gym in the evening, and quiet nights at home. The house was a bit drafty, and the pipes groaned whenever I turned on the hot water, but nothing about it seemed out of the ordinary. The town itself was small, the kind of place where people notice a new face. The first week, A few neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves. An older woman from across the street who brought over homemade cookies. A guy a few houses down who offered to help if I ever needed anything. They all seemed friendly enough, but there was something about the way they talked about the house that stuck with me. "Nice little place," one of them said, then hesitated. "How's it been for you so far?" "Good," I answered. "Why?" He shook his head quickly, forcing a smile. "No reason. Just, you know, old houses make strange noises." That was the first time I felt something was off. Still, I brushed it aside. I wasn't the type to get worked up over stories or let my imagination run wild. Besides, I liked living alone. There was something peaceful about it. The first few nights were uneventful. I slept fine, woke up early for work, and spent my evenings watching TV or reading. The silence was nice. No noisy roommates, no traffic sounds outside. Just quiet. But then, little things started happening. He'd set something down on the kitchen counter, only to find it moved later. The bathroom light would be on when I knew he'd turned it off. At first, I blamed myself. I was adjusting to a new place, probably just being forgetful. Then came the footsteps. At night, when everything was still, I'd hear it, soft, deliberate steps moving across the floor. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling. But these weren't random creaks or groans. They were distinct, like someone walking barefoot on wood. One night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A slow step. Then another. It was coming from the hallway. I sat up, heart pounding. My bedroom door was slightly open, just enough that I could see the dark outline of the hallway beyond. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just listened. Then, nothing. Silence. I told myself it was in my head. Maybe it imagined it, half asleep. But deep down, I knew better. And that was just the beginning. The footsteps didn't stop after that first night. I tried to ignore them at first, telling myself it was the old wooden floors shifting, the winds, or even just my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I heard them, the harder it became to pretend they weren't real. They weren't random creaks or distant noises. They were footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the house at night when I should have been the only one there. It always started the same way. It'd be lying in bed, barely paying attention, and then, just at the edge of hearing, it'd catch it, a soft, measured step, then another. Some nights, they would stop as quickly as they started. Other times, they would continue, moving from the hallway to the living room, sometimes near the kitchen. Always careful, always steady. The first time it truly unsettled me, I was in bed with the covers pulled up, staring at my phone. The house was silent except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator. I had almost forgotten about the noises entirely, convincing myself it had just been my imagination. Then I heard it. A slow step. Then another. I held my breath. It was coming from the hallway again, just outside my room. I stared at the open bedroom door, my pulse hammering in my ears. The hallway beyond was completely dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of my phone screen. I strained my ears, waiting for another sound. Nothing. For a long moment, I sat completely still, listening. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe the house settling, maybe a draft. But then something changed. The footsteps didn't just stop. They stopped right outside my door. A heavy silence followed, thick and unnatural. It was as if whoever or whatever had been walking had just paused, standing there, listening. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I should have gotten up, checked the hallway, turned on the lights, something. But I didn't. I couldn't. My body refused to move, as if some deep, primal instinct was screaming at me to stay still. Minutes passed. I must have been holding my breath because my chest ached. And then, Just when I thought maybe I had imagined it, a soft creak, the sound of pressure being lifted off the floor, like someone shifting their weight. That was it. That was enough. I shot up, heart racing, and turned on my bedside lamp. The warm yellow glow filled the room instantly, but the hallway beyond my door remained dark. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it into the hallway. Nothing. The floor was empty. The shadows stretched long and undisturbed. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. There was no one there. I exhaled slowly, my skin clammy. I had never felt this way before. I'd lived alone before, but I had never felt watched like this. Still, I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had dozed off for a second and dreamed it. It was late. I was tired. That had to be it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound, every shift in the house made me snap my eyes open. It was a relief when morning finally came. But the feeling didn't go away. The next night, I locked my bedroom door. I don't know why. It wasn't like a locked door would do anything if someone was actually inside. But it gave me a small sense of control. I double-checked the front door, made sure the windows were locked, and left the hallway light on. At first, everything seemed fine. I lay in bed, scrolling through my phone, my ears tuned to every little sound. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, sometime past 2 a.m., I heard it again. Not footsteps this time. Something softer. A rustling sound, like fabric shifting. I froze, my fingers tightening around my phone. The sound was coming from the second bedroom, the one I never used. My stomach twisted. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The noise continued, just a faint, shuffling movement, like someone shifting inside the room. I had left that door open earlier in the day, hadn't I? I strained my memory, trying to recall. I was sure I had. But now, as I stared at the faint sliver of light at the bottom of the door, I realized it was shut. I hadn't shut it. The air in my lungs felt trapped. I wanted to get up, check it, but my body wouldn't listen. Every logical thought in my brain told me to stay put, that I didn't want to know what was on the other side. The sound stopped. A long silence followed. Then, tap. A single, light tap against the door. That was it. I scrambled out of bed, flicking on every light in the house. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I stood there in the too bright hallway, staring at the second bedroom door like it might burst open at any second. The silence stretched on. I didn't want to open it. I really didn't. But I couldn't just stand there all night. Taking a shaky breath, I reached out and grabbed the doorknob. It was ice cold. I turned it slowly, the mechanism clicking as I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The dresser was still there, the window shut, the air stale and undisturbed. Nothing had been moved. Nothing was out of place. But I could feel it. Something was wrong. The hair on my arm stood on end. I backed away, shutting the door again, and went straight to the living room. I left the lights on, turned on the TV for background noise, and sat there until sunrise. By morning, I almost convinced myself it had been my imagination again. But I knew better. Something had been in that room, and it wasn't going away. I wish I could say that was the worst of it, that after that night, things went back to normal, but they didn't. If anything, that was just the beginning. The footsteps, the rustling, the sense of being watched, it all got worse. Much worse. The following nights were restless. No matter how much I tried to convince myself I had been imagining things, my body knew better. My nerves were constantly on edge, my muscles tense, like I was bracing for something. I left more lights on, Started sleeping with the TV on for noise, but it didn't help because the noises didn't stop. And then, on the fourth night after the first incident, something new happened. It was around 1:30 a.m. I had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket draped over me, the glow of the TV flickering against the walls. Everything was quiet. No creaks, no rustling, no taps. And then, out of nowhere, the TV shut off. The room was swallowed in darkness. I jolted awake, my heart slamming into my ribs. I blinked against the pitch black, trying to adjust. The hum of the fridge was gone. The ticking of the clock had stopped. The power was out. That in itself wasn't the problem. It was an old house. Outages happen sometimes. But then I heard it. Somewhere in the dark. Click. The unmistakable sound of a light switch being flipped. I turned my head toward the hallway. My stomach dropped. The light in the second bedroom flicked on. The door was still shut. My skin crawled. I sat up slowly, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stay still, to not go check. But I had to. I needed to know. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stood. My legs felt weak as I made my way toward the hallway. The door to the second bedroom stood in front of me. The light glowed from the gap beneath it, stretching faintly across the wooden floor. I reached for the knob. My hand was shaking. Before I could turn it, click! The light shut off again. The hallway plunged back into darkness. I backed away, breathing hard. My flashlight beam wobbled as I turned it toward the door. My own shadow stretched across it, flickering. I forced myself to open the door. The room was empty. Nothing had changed. But the light switch was flipped down, as if someone had been in there. As if someone had turned it off right before I opened the door. I didn't sleep that night. After that, the house changed. The air inside felt different, heavier, thicker, like I was constantly walking through something unseen. The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It was filled with something, a presence. I started hearing whispers. They were never loud, just soft enough that I couldn't quite make out the words. Sometimes they came from the hallway when I was in bed. Other times I heard them in the kitchen when I was making coffee, faint and distant, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. Once I swore I heard my own name. I told myself I was sleep deprived, that my brain was making things up. But then one night I caught something on my phone. I had started recording myself sleeping, half as a joke, half because I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I set my phone on the nightstand, hit record, and went to sleep. The next morning, I played it back. Most of it was normal, just the sound of me shifting, breathing. But then, around 3:12 a.m., the audio changed. The sound of my breathing was still there, but underneath it, layered so faintly, I had to turn the volume all the way up. There was another breath. Not mine. Slow, deep, right next to the microphone. I threw my phone across the room. The worst night, the one that finally made me realize I had to get out, happened a week later. By then, I was barely sleeping. I kept the lights on at all times. I had started keeping my bedroom door shut, but I knew it didn't make a difference. Whatever was in the house didn't care about doors. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up. Not to a sound, not to a whisper, just to a feeling. Something was wrong. The air was freezing, the kind of cold that seeped into your skin. My breath came out in small, visible puffs. I reached for my phone to check the time, and then I saw it. The door to my bedroom wasn't shut anymore. It was open, a few inches, enough to see into the dark hallway beyond, enough for something to be standing there. My stomach twisted. I lifted my phone, shining the flashlight toward the door, and for a split second, I saw it. A figure, tall, motionless, standing just outside the doorway, watching me. I sucked in a sharp breath, and then the light flickered. The moment the flashlight wavered, the figure was gone. But the door, it creaked, opening another inch. That was enough. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and bolted. I didn't stop until I was in my car, locked inside, my hands trembling against the wheel. I stared back at the house, at the dark windows staring back at me. Something was inside, and it didn't want me there anymore. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could still feel it, the presence from the hallway, the figure that had been standing just outside my door. The house loomed in front of me, dark and silent. From the outside, it looked normal, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something was inside, and it had been watching me. I should have driven away. I should have left right then and there, but something stopped me. My laptop, my wallet, my ID, everything I needed was still inside. And the thought of leaving without them, of abandoning everything, made me hesitate. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was denial. But a part of me, some desperate, irrational part, needed to believe that I was wrong. That it had just been my imagination. That if I went back inside, nothing would happen. That was my mistake. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped out of the car. My legs were shaking as I made my way back to the front door. The house was still. No sounds, no movement. I reached the porch, hesitating for a second before unlocking the door. It swung open with a low creak. The air inside was ice cold. I stepped in. The moment I crossed the threshold, my chest tightened. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, leave, get out. But I ignored them. I moved fast, trying to keep my breathing steady. The only sound was the faint hum of my phone's flashlight as I hurried to the bedroom. I grabbed my laptop, my wallet, shoved everything into my bag. Then, just as I was about to leave, I heard it. A single creak from the hallway. I froze. It was close. My hand clenched around my bag strap. I turned my head slightly, my heart hammering. The door to my bedroom was still open. The hallway beyond it was dark. But then, another sound. Not a creak. A breath. A long, slow inhale. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. Every part of me locked up as I stood there, listening. The breath was coming from just outside my door. I turned my phone toward it, the flashlight casting a narrow beam into the hallway. And that's when I saw it. The figure was there, just beyond the doorway. I barely registered its shape, tall, gaunt, completely still. But the face, oh God, the face. Its skin was stretched too tight, almost translucent, as if it had been pulled over its skull. The eyes were sunken pits of shadow, and the mouth was too wide. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just watched me. And then, it grinned. That was all it took. I ran. I didn't care if I dropped anything. I didn't care if I tripped or made noise. I ran. I bolted past it, my shoulder barely brushing against something cold and solid. The moment I reached the living room, the air changed. The temperature plummeted even more. The walls seemed to contract. The lights flickered. And behind me, I heard it move. Not footsteps. Not shuffling. Something worse. It was fast. A blur of motion. The air rushed past me. I felt it, the weight of something enormous pressing down, something unseen but terrifyingly real. I didn't stop. I didn't look. I tore through the front door, nearly ripping it off the hinges, and sprinted for my car. The moment I crossed the threshold, Everything stopped. The air, the sound, the presence. I reached my car, yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. For a few agonizing seconds, I couldn't breathe. My hands shook violently as I tried to jam the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. My headlights flared on, illuminating the porch, and it was there, standing in the doorway, still smiling. My stomach dropped. My vision blurred with panic as I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement, and I shot down the driveway, away from that house. I didn't stop. I didn't dare stop. I just drove. And in the rearview mirror, for a split second, I thought I saw something. A shape! Standing in the middle of the road, watching me disappear into the night. I didn't stop driving for what felt like hours. The road ahead was a blur, the trees on either side blending into a dark smear as I sped away from that house. My chest was tight, my breath shaky, my hands gripping the wheels so hard my fingers ached. But no matter how fast I went, no matter how much distance I put between myself and that place, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching. Somewhere, somehow, the air inside the car was thick with that same suffocating presence. It pressed against my skin, crawled up my spine like cold fingers trailing over my neck. I glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing. But that didn't mean it was gone. I didn't go home. That was the one thing I knew for sure. I wasn't going anywhere familiar, anywhere it could follow me. Instead, I pulled into a gas station a few towns over, parking under the bright fluorescent lights. I sat there, my hands still shaking, trying to catch my breath. A part of me wanted to believe it was over, that I had escaped, that whatever had been in that house was bound to it, trapped inside those walls. But another part of me, the logical part, knew better. Because as I sat there, staring blankly at the dashboard, I realized something terrifying. I never heard a door close. When I ran out of that house, when I tore through the front door, I never shut it behind me. And when I saw that thing standing in the doorway, grinning at me, the door had still been open. A pit formed in my stomach. What if it wasn't bound to that house? What if it had followed me? The thought sent a violent shudder through my body. I turned off the engine, grabbed my phone, and tried to think. Where could I go? Who could I even tell? I couldn't call the police. What would I say? That a shadowy figure with an impossibly wide grin had chased me out of my house? That I had felt something inhuman in the darkness? They'd laugh me out of the station. No! This was something I had to figure out myself. I pulled up my phone, scrolling through my contacts. There was only one person I could think of, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who might actually understand. A guy named Nate. I had met him in college. He had been the kind of person who was obsessed with the paranormal, always talking about hauntings, cursed places, things that normal people would brush off as superstition. Back then, I had thought he was crazy. Now, I wasn't so sure. I hesitated for a second, then typed out a message. Nate, I know this is random, but I need help. Something happened. Something I can't explain. I don't know who else to ask. I didn't expect a response right away. But within seconds, my phone buzzed. Nate, where are you? I exhaled, glancing around the empty gas station. Just outside of Springwood. I had to leave my house. Something was there. Nate, leave. Now. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly typed back. What? Why? His reply was almost instant. Because if you're still in one place, it knows where you are. I didn't ask questions. I started the car and drove. Nate and I met at a diner just outside the next town over. He looked different, older, rougher, like someone who had seen things he didn't want to talk about. The moment I sat down across from him, He didn't waste time with small talk. Tell me everything. So I did. I told him about the house, about the strange noises, the figures in the dark, the night I saw it standing in my doorway. Nate listened in silence, his face unreadable. When I finished, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. You didn't just see something, he said. You brought it with you. I swallowed hard. What does that mean? Nate rubbed his face. That thing you saw? It's not a ghost. It's not something that just haunts places. It attaches to people. It finds someone, watches them, feeds off them. He shook his head. You stayed in that house too long. It chose you. My stomach twisted. So what do I do? For the first time, Nate looked genuinely uncertain. There's no easy way to get rid of something like that, he admitted. You could try leaving town, putting more distance between you and the house. But that doesn't always work. What does? He hesitated. You need to confront it. My breath caught. What? You left that house in a panic. That's what it wants, fear. It feeds on it. If you go back, if you face it and show it that you're not afraid. He trailed off. I understood what he was implying. If I didn't confront it, it wouldn't leave me alone. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to forget it, to run, to never go back to that house. But I knew Nate was right. If I didn't end this, it would never stop. So hours later, just before sunrise, I found myself standing in front of that cursed house once again. The door was still open. The air inside was still cold. I stepped over the threshold, my heart pounding like a war drum. And then, a breath, right behind me. I turned slowly, and it was there, closer than before, smiling that same horrible smile. I swallowed my fear, forcing my voice to stay steady. I'm not afraid of you. The figure didn't move. I know what you are, I continued, and am done letting you control me. It tilted its head as if amused. The room darkened. The air thickened, pressing down on me. But I held my ground, and for the first time, the figure's smile faltered. Then, a sound, a crackling, guttural noise that almost sounded like a laugh. And just like that, it faded. The weight lifted. The darkness receded. I was alone. For the first time in weeks, the house felt empty. It was over. I didn't stay long. I gathered the last of my things, locked the door behind me, and left that house for good. I never looked back. I moved far away, changed my number, made sure nothing tied me back to that place. But even now, years later, I still wonder, did I really get rid of it? Or is it still out there, watching, waiting? I may never know, but one thing's for sure. I'll never go near that house again. It's been years now. Years since I left that house. Since I faced whatever was in there. Since I walked out the door and never looked back. Most nights, I don't think about it. Most nights, I sleep without worry, without checking the locks 3 or 4 times, without glancing over my shoulder when I step outside. Most nights, but not all, because some nights, when the house is silent, when the air is still, and am lying awake in the dark, I swear I hear something. Not footsteps, not whispers, just breathing, close, too close. But when I turn on the light, when I sit up and scan the room, there's nothing there. At least, nothing I can see. I've tried to move on, to live a normal life, to forget that house and everything that came with it. And for the most part, I have. I found a new place. I made sure it was in a busy neighborhood, surrounded by people, away from anything even remotely isolated. I filled it with light, no dark corners, no empty hallways where shadows could gather. And yet, no matter how safe I try to make this place, that feeling never fully goes away. The feeling that I'm not alone. that something is still there, watching, waiting, and I meant it. But there was one last thing I had to do. Months after I left, I drove past the house one final time. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. But I looked, and what I saw has stayed with me ever since. The house was empty, windows boarded up, paint peeling, the yard overgrown. No signs of life. No signs that anyone had stepped foot inside since the night I ran. But just as I passed, in that fraction of a second when I glanced toward the front door, I saw it, standing there, smiling, exactly where I had left it, like it had been waiting. I kept driving, and I never went back. I don't tell this story to scare people. I don't tell it for sympathy or attention. I tell it as a warning. There are places in this world that hold things we aren't meant to understand. Things that don't just haunt houses, they haunt people. So if you ever feel like something is watching you, if you ever hear footsteps at night when no one is there, if you ever wake up to find your door open when you know you closed it, don't ignore it. Because some things, they don't just go away. They wait. And sooner or later, they come back.